I'm Jan Erickson. I'm a CWI co-president and government relations director at NOW. I also, in another life, worked on elections and promoted candidates. So those were tremendous years for gaining the experience that helps you later on and figuring out what to do with your life. So we have a wonderful a list of speakers here. And I might add Connie Cordovilla, a longtime feminist activist, is working with me, and she will be moderating the chat. Before I begin, let me just say that the Clearinghouse is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we do not endorse any candidates, and we do not donate any to any political candidates. So we are strictly informational here, and that is the intent of this discussion today, to provide you with some great info on the election and the candidates that are running on our issues. So we ask you to put your questions and your comments in the chat, and we'll deal with those at the end of the speakers' presentations. So anyway, without further ado, we had a recent change in our list of speakers, and we're absolutely thrilled to have a special guest speaker from Emily's list. I'm sure that all of you have heard and probably contribute to Emily's list, and they are undoubtedly a factor in, I think, many elections across the country. Because some of you may not have seen the invitation where we announced Christina Reynolds as being our special guest speaker. I'm just going to note a couple of things from her very impressive resume. She joined Emily's list after nearly 2 decades of experience as communications and content senior vice president. She is a lifelong fighter for progressive causes, and she's managed large-scale press operations from the campaign trail to the White House. She's worked as a communications director for Hillary for America. Boy, we all remember that. And as White House Director of Media Affairs and Special Assistant to President Obama. She's been a research and policy director at the DCCC during the 2006 midterms, and has been in senior roles in presidential and Senate campaigns. And without further ado, I would like to turn the mic over to Christina Reynolds, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you for having me. This is my favorite kind of conversation to have. And so I am so grateful to be a part of it. Just to give everyone, to start off with a little intro of Emily's list and what we do and why we do it, which I suspect we all know firsthand because we're all here. Emily's List is an organization started about 40 years ago by a woman named Ellen Malcolm. I should first say, Emily is not a name, it is an acronym. It stands for Early Money is Like Yeast, because it makes the dough rise. That is rooted in our founding nearly 40 years ago. At that point, no Democratic woman had been elected of her own right into the US Senate, which is not that long ago and a little crazy to think about. But Ellen was very frustrated, having watched in the 1984 election 2 Democratic women come close, but not ever be considered truly viable candidates, and therefore they couldn't raise the money they needed, and therefore they finished just a little bit short. She viewed it as a vicious cycle. She said, we need to do something to prove to people that these women can win. And so she gathered up a bunch of her friends in her basement, said, bring your Rolodexes, and we're going to write everyone that we know, and we're going to ask for $100 for Barbara Mikulski, who was at the time running for Senate in Maryland. They raised money for Barbara Mikulski. They raised money for this new organization. And Mikulski won, obviously, I believe, still holds the record as the longest woman serving woman in the Senate, and did a lot of good while she was there. Since then, Emily's List has expanded. We have moved to work across the country and up and down the ballot. We can't be everywhere, obviously, but what we try and do is endorse candidates in city council, in some cases, in some mayor's races, legislatures, on up all the way to we are very proud to be very big supporters of Kamala Harris, who is a testament to our work. We have been with Vice President Harris since her first race as San Francisco DA, and have been proud to stand with her on various levels of the ballot. What we do in that work is help raise money for our candidates. We have an online community that we introduce our candidates to and hopefully help them raise directly into those candidates. Ellen was arguably one of the founders of the idea of bundling, and literally used to collect checks and bundle them together and mail them directly to the campaign. But we have expanded, and so now we run independent expenditures in some cases. We help amplify our candidates and introduce them to our audiences. We do candidate services. So sometimes we'll go in and help candidates hire staff or build a budget or do debate prep or things like that, all with an effort of making our government look more like the people it represents. We do this work because we know that government runs better when it is more representative, that we know that when women are given an equal playing foot to run off of, they win. And when they run and win, the women that we help elect make things better for all of us, make things better, especially for women across this country. And so we are very proud to have helped elect 1,700 women in races across the country. And counting, hopefully, and hopefully we'll break that last glass ceiling. But I get asked a lot, especially I was lucky enough to work at Emily's List in 2018, which was the second so-called year of the woman in federal elections that I'm sure we all remember. We elected enough women, 23 women, which was enough to flip the House by women alone. We're glad that some of the dudes won, but we could have done it with just women, which was always a nice feeling. Making Nancy Pelosi speaker again. And I get asked frequently, but from reporters, okay, great. So job well done, right? Mission accomplished. To which I frequently note, we are, as the people on this Zoom no doubt know, we are just over a quarter of Congress is women in a country that is more than half women, and that where women are certainly more than half of the voters. In state legislatures, we do a little better, but we hover around a third, which is still not good enough. We have states that have never elected a woman governor, unfortunately, a large number of them. We've obviously never elected a woman president. And one of my I would say favorite, it's not favorite, one of my least favorite fun facts is that there have been more episodes of Grey's Anatomy than women elected to Congress in the history of this country. We can do better than that. We know that we can. And so that's one of the things that we aim to do. We're not alone in this space, certainly. But what we try and look at is what are the challenges that women face. And so just very briefly, I'll run through a few of them. Women who run for office are othered, right? They are frequently called out by their differences. So I like to point out there are weapons in punditry used against them. When we talk about things like electability, we are frequently referring to what have we elected before. So in races where we haven't elected women, then women are considered unelectable or less electable, even though there's always got to be a first. So that's one thing. We hear things like likability and authenticity used as a weapon against women and candidates of color, the candidates that we have not elected as much, whereas we assume from white men that, either they are likable or they don't have to be. The Barbara Lee Family Foundation has done some phenomenal research on this that finds that women who run for office have to be both electable and likable. Men who run for office can be one or the other. Amy Klobuchar kind of put her finger on this during a debate when she noted that a woman who had been a mayor the size of a city like South Bend probably wouldn't be taken as seriously as Mayor Pete was. That's the unfortunate thing. The flip side of or the horrible flip side of that is that often women's accomplishments are diminished. I will never forget in 2018 a news story in which Abigail Spanberger's opponent questioned her service. She was a CIA officer, as many people know, and questioned her service. And the news article sort of allowed him to do it, noted that he had been, this was her primary opponent, that he had served in the Marine Corps, and then called her, again, a veteran of the CIA, called her a willowy blonde. So, we see that accomplishments are often diminished. This is an adage, and I think people in the corporate space will tell you this is the idea of men can have potential, women have to have met that potential already. This is changing, and we're really grateful for it changing, but it is one of the challenges that women face. We see the othering of women candidates. And again, most of this also applies to candidates of color. So women of color get it doubly, twice as bad. Misinformation and disinformation, which is a plague on social media and on politics in general. When it is aimed at men, it is typically about their policies. When it is aimed at women, it is about their race or their gender. And so what that means is when they are pushing back on it, they are doing so in a frame of, yes, I am different than you, and here's how, instead of, let me tell you about my policies. And you can see why that changes things for voters, that at least doesn't allow the candidate to live in a policy space and explain what they're going to do and what their vision is. One of the other things that we see pretty significantly is the idea of holding the candidates to different standards. I mean, how they look is one thing, although I worked for John Edwards and he may be the rare male candidate who is judged by his hair. But we see women are judged by their hair, by what they wear in different ways than men are, and it requires different things. We also see that their ambition is judged differently. And that's something you saw very acutely when the now vice president, was being considered to be on the ticket, where people were publicly out there saying, does she want it too much? I would like my president to want to be president. I would like and I believe that people who are aspiring to that office should have ambition. We do not judge men for it. We tend to judge women more. All of these, and I'll turn it back because I've rambled too long, but all of these are some of the things that women candidates face. The good, and then the very tactical, your network tends to be people like you. And so a gender gap that is especially true for Black women, for Latinas, for Native women, a gender pay gap impacts them even more. They often have to work harder to raise that money. The good news is, when we give candidates the tools that they need, we see women get elected. We see them get in there and do an amazing job, but it is still work. And so that's why I'm here. That's why Emily's List is here. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you all about what that means in today's day and age.
Thank you so much, Christina. We'll have to come back again in 2 years, possibly, and see if we're beginning to turn that curve insofar as the proportion of women in Congress and state legislatures. And that surely should be a goal of many of our organizations, to start building that up to closer to 50%. And one of our speakers works for an organization that's dedicated to just doing that. Well, for this discussion today, we listed a whole bunch of questions, probably too many. And I was asked to talk about what the key issues are in this election, which of course would take several days. But the most overriding issue, as we all know, is reproductive rights. And it appears that this is going to be a pivotal question in a number of elections. Maybe not all of the swing states. I think that remains to be seen, but certainly the commentary is going towards the women's vote, meaning the gender gap could be pivotal. in the outcome in at least a few of those swing states. I think we're all waiting for bated breath for more good news about the polling that's going on right now, which appears to be neck and neck. But I will say, as somebody who in another life did a lot of political survey research for candidates, that it's very hard to really tell what a dedicated group of voters focused on one issue will do to the outcome. So I think we just need to keep that in mind and be hopeful that folks who are motivated by protecting women's reproductive rights will get to the polls. Many of them have already gone, a tremendous early turnout that's been reported, and will make a big difference in this election. I think we don't need to be reminded that there are 11 abortion-related ballot measures. 10 of them are protecting women's reproductive rights. Nebraska has one that decides the length of time for an abortion. But none of those states are swing states, so that may not make too much of a difference. But moving right along, we are going to have several very expert speakers address the questions that we proposed in our planning for this discussion. And our first speaker, Tamaya Dennard of Represent Women, will address, and let me just say that she'll be talking about what do we know about the feminist candidates? Are there various obstacles that we see from time to time that get in the way of feminist candidates being successfully elected? And does holding strong views, I don't know what they would be at this point. It seems like all of our views are strong, affect the election of feminist candidates, and what reforms and resources are needed to encourage feminist women to enter politics and succeed. That's quite a mouthful, and I will also urge our additional speakers to chime in once Tamaya has made her presentation. And I'd like to further note that Represent Women is an incredible organization that I was not altogether familiar with, but I want to encourage you to go to their website and look at the work that they're doing to try to remove those obstacles. So Tamaya, we are thrilled to have you. She is State Partnerships Manager from Represent Women, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jan. It's quite an honor to be here with all of you. Represent Women, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And what kind of differentiates us from a lot of organizations is that there are a lot of organizations that, you know, train women, help women run, but for us, it's about systems reform. So, you know, what can we do to change the system so that women can run as sustainable? Because oftentimes if someone changes something while they're in office, and if they're voted out, when they're voted out, that change is not sustainable. So that's why we tend to focus on more systems reform. I think for us as an organization that works for gender parity, we don't necessarily parse women candidates on their politics, because we are a nonprofit and can't support one candidate over the other. So we choose to focus more on systems reform. I think it's harder now just because the country's in a different place than it was even 4 years ago, and things that have historically been, bipartisan or nonpartisan or nonpartisan issues and things that we have in the past have not, visited. As you could take Roe versus Wade as an example, those things are lightning rods now. So for us, when we think about, the gender gap and who's voting, I think it was Politico who did a story recently about the gender gap. The gender gap for the last election, I think Biden had a gender gap of 47 to 42. I think Hillary before that, her gender gap was 13%. This particular race, it looks like the gender gap will be anywhere upwards to 60 to 20%. And I think that is largely due to reproductive rights being on the ballot in the states that you mentioned, Jan. So we know that women vote at a higher rate than men. So it'll be interesting to see, how that translates, because also Trump's current distance between he and Harris's distance between men is also not that wide. She has he only has a 10% gap in male candidates. And I think a lot of that boils down to, what we define as feminist candidates, as we talk about in the question. I think one is recognizing that a feminist candidate doesn't necessarily have to be a woman. It's any candidate who, is a champion for equal rights or an advocate for either upholding or creating equal rights for women. And I think for one of the questions you asked is, are there different obstacles for women political candidates than for actively feminist candidates? There are definite obstacles. You have to be even careful, even at Represent Women, we're careful in how we word things because, again, it's just certain words, certain language triggers, and people automatically assume when you say certain things, they're automatically, Republican or Democrat. We think about, upholding equal rights as a nonpartisan a nonpartisan thing. Like we would want, as you said so eloquently, Christina, having more women in office makes our democracy stronger. And that's what I thought we all wanted, but maybe that's not, based on the election that we're looking at now, it's not what we want anymore. We don't necessarily want democracy, but, we Represent Women, we fight and we urge for, we urge parity because it makes our democracy stronger, in addition to just being the right thing to do. I think that, holding feminist views does impact a person's ability to be elected or reelected in a way that it didn't even as few as 4 years ago. That's for sure. And I think so I won't talk super long because there's a lot to talk about today. I think feminists, if someone doesn't have the lived experience of being a woman, it doesn't automatically exclude them from being feminist, but you have to recognize that privilege plays a huge role in that. If you have a system that's created for men and by men, undoubtedly you're not going to be able to capture the experiences of women. Thus, issues that impact women are either going to fall through the cracks if not addressed at all. And I think that's one of the major challenges for not having a representative democracy. So I think one of the things we have to think about in terms of what's driving those gender gaps, women now are being, there's more college graduates who are women now than it used to be. And I think that's probably one of the main drivers, because if you think about something like college loan forgiveness, which, for me, having a lot of debt, that's huge. But if you're not someone who's experiencing that, it's not as a big deal to you. So if you were to ask me what probably is the largest driver between the gap in how women and men vote, that would have to be one of them. The other to me is a status quo maintenance. Why would I contribute to a system that is appearing to take away my power? And I always have this quote that that I share with folks, and that quote is, if you believe in freedom until your freedom is threatened, it's not freedom that you actually believe in, it's your own privilege. So I think that's what we're looking at as it relates to what's happening in the gender gap between men and women in this voting cycle.
Thank you so much, Tamaya. I think all of your observations and comments are very well taken. And as we move on to the other expert speakers, you can certainly chime in when you think it's appropriate after they've spoken, because the issues that you've discussed are very expansive. I want to introduce our other panelists. Karen Humphrey is a local California state and national leader from the National Women's Political Caucus. That's an organization many of us joined at one point in time. And she is a former TV reporter and first woman mayor of Fresno, California, from where she is speaking today. So welcome, Karen. And then we have Linda Berg, a dear friend and attorney who was a long time now political director, manager of NowPAC, and is the current acting political director for Feminist Majority. In 2022, Linda was the founder of an independent expenditure PAC called Vote for Equality, which is actively working on getting out the vote on college campuses in the battleground states. They will take lead in answering questions about feminist candidates, feminist organizations, and voters, and as that Vote for Equality group will do, and help keep these folks together, working for victory in the 2024 elections. So the next set of questions we have is, what do we know about women or men feminist voters? What drives the gender gap in voting? What percentage of women and men consider feminist issues in deciding who to vote for? And are certain demographic groups of voters likely to be feminists? All weighty questions. Linda.
Thank you, Jan. All of those questions could be talked about until the election day. So I'm going to try to synthesize as best I can. And I'm going to concentrate on why women and men vote differently and what is driving the gender gap and what does it mean. And as you all know, this is an election unlike any election that we've ever experienced. Some would say it's the most significant in our nation's history. But because of that, everything that we know about polling and how people are going to behave have really come under fire. And we know that the polling wasn't great last time, certainly before the election. And so I'm going to base a lot of what I talk about what we do know about what happened in the last election, and try to show what, if that holds, what that would mean this election. I have to say everything's conjecture when you watch MSNBC or CNN or any of the talk shows. Nobody knows. The pollsters are all arguing about what it means, and people are very nervous about projections. And if you saw any of the polls yesterday, they were dead even. Everything was within the margin of error. So does that mean everything's going to break one way because there's a scandal that's going to happen? Is everything going to break another way? Are they going to split? I mean, nobody really knows. But I, from watching all this stuff and reading all this stuff, I came to the conclusion that one of the most important things that's happening in this election cycle is the role of whisperers. Now, I know that sounds odd, but whispering, and let me try to explain. We know in the last presidential election that women were 54.7% of the electorate and men were 44%. And so women turn out more than men. Now, each state is slightly different. Each battleground state is slightly different. And for some reason, Wisconsin, they were exactly the same, but that was the only one that I saw that was. So I wanted to show you what that means when you actually look at the battleground states. And I want to thank Jan's wonderful intern, Caitlin, because she crunched the numbers that I might not have been able to put together as well as she did about what it means. But I'm going to take a state like Pennsylvania. Everyone says that Harris can't win without Pennsylvania. That is one of the most important states. So in the recent Marist polls, women supported Harris by 55 to 43%, 43% for Trump, while men supported Harris 44% and Trump by 54%. So clearly there's a gender gap. But in the 2020 election, women accounted for many more votes than men. They were 53% of the electorate and men were 47%. So therefore, if you put that together, if you took the gender gap as remaining close to what it was in 2020, and then you look at the preference polls now, it would turn out that Harris would get an extra 2 million votes over Trump. Harris would win over Trump. And so she would take that state. Another state where it's not quite as clear is North Carolina, because there in the Marist poll, Harris is getting 54% of the women's vote, and Trump is getting 54% of the men's vote. So that seems a little confusing. But in 2020, women were 56% of the electorate. So again, if you play that out, then you would find Harris would win very narrowly in North Carolina by 35,000 votes. I would suspect that's why you saw Trump in North Carolina, 3 different places yesterday, because he knows that the hurricane hit there. He's got a lot of his friends there. He's going to try to get rid of that gender gap. In Michigan, the same kind of thing happened. The Marist poll finds 56% of women favor Harris, 52% of men favor Trump. In 2020, Michigan electorate was 54% women and 46% men. So if you apply that all together, Harris wins by 3%. On the other hand, there are 2 states where that gender gap doesn't show up so well, and those are Georgia and Arizona. In Georgia, CBS poll seems to find that more men are planning to vote for Trump, 56%, than women voting for Harris. So if you took the gender gap numbers and what the turnout numbers were, Trump would win the state this time by 117,000 votes, rather than the very famous 11,000 that we know about from all the litigation. And in Arizona, it's closer. Slightly more men favor Trump than women favor Harris. So if they put all those numbers together, Trump wins the state by 0.77% of the vote, or 25,000 votes. So what this exercise shows very starkly is that if the composition of the electorate between men and women is the same as 2020 or close to 2020, Harris will win Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada. They were all states that Biden won. She could also win North Carolina by a very narrow margin. That's why he's so paying a lot of attention to that. Trump could win Arizona and Georgia, 2 Biden states. So that would be concerning to them. But that still would result in a Harris win in the Electoral College. The bottom line is that if the gender gap in presidential preferences remains the same, but men's turnout increases dramatically relative to 2020, that's when Harris gets in trouble. And that's when it's good for Trump. If women's turnout stays the same, it could be a good year for Harris if there's not a huge increase of male voters. And so that, to me, immediately explains why all what they call, the New York Times calls it bro whispering. It's the locker room talk. It's the shocking rhetoric. It's the insults. It's the misogyny. It's the not having to follow the rules. It's the macho man. Although what he's doing dancing to YMCA, I'm a little confused about. But that's what he's doing. And he's getting out what they have found is the less engaged voter, particularly the young men. In the past 4 years, as they've become less and less engaged, their voter registrations have gone up 14 points more Republican than they used to be. That's who he's trying to get out. You can see it on their faces when you watch that Arnold Porter joke thing. Who was howling in the background? But the men. I mean, they were clearly delighted at all that locker room talk. So I think that's his strategy. And I think people underestimate Trump because of all the reasons that we think he's unhinged, or a lot of us do, put it that way. But he's very clever. He was very clever in 2016. He knew where his voters were. He knew how to get them out. And I think he knows how to act boorishly. And he's having a grand time doing it. And he's trying to get on all the men. But there is another side to the whispering. And that I have to quote Liz Cheney, of all people, who I would never in my wildest dreams ever believe I would use her name approvingly. But what she says is that she has spoken to many, many, many Republican voters. And they all live in a tribal situation. In a way, their families, their friends, their neighborhoods, their communities are all Republican. They don't dare say out loud that they find him boorish. They don't want him president. They think he's dangerous. But they tell Cheney they whisper to Cheney, when they go into that voting booth, they're going to vote for Harris. And I think we have to hope that this is a big phenomenon. She thinks it is. We have to hope that's the same. So I think that probably took my 5 minutes. There's so much that we could keep talking about, but we've just got to hope for a lot of women to march to the polls. That is, just statistically, almost no matter who they are, if we get women out to vote, we will win. Women's rights will win. That's the main thing. So thanks.
Great. Well, some good news and not so good news. A little bit more, I think, on the side of good news. Thank you, Linda, so much for looking at all those numbers and coming up with your insight. And if you want to jump in after Karen speaks, we're dealing with some more discussion. I think we have time for that before we go to the chat. But right now, we would love to have Karen Humphrey talk about the status and role of feminist organizations in supporting the successful election of feminist candidates. And I think she's prepared some information on how do feminist voters find out if candidates have feminist views, and what are their records, and what organizations identify and support feminist candidates, and how do they inform the public. Anyway, other topics along those lines, and I know Karen is really interested from a lifetime of working for women to be elected. Karen, please take it away from Fresno.
Thank you, Jan. And I'm delighted to see all these people. And I have to admit, I'm no longer in Fresno, I'm in Sacramento.
Oh,
So
sorry.
but it's part of the same valley and it has some of the same issues. So California is a great place to be. Interestingly enough, we will have parity 40-40 in the state Senate, 2020 in the state Senate, which is 40 members when the new legislature is sworn in, because after the primary, the results will come out that way in November. We will not be anywhere near 50-50 in the assembly, which has 80 members, but we're moving, and so are many other states. I just want to say, between now and 2 weeks from now, GOTV, do everything you can, and it's easy enough to find online resources to call, walk, send money, etc. So that's the key. And one other overall comment: we're in a period of backlash where NWPC began in 71, now began in 66, and many other organizations have come along since. And the powering of the backlash, much of which goes to very rich white men who don't want the world to change, and who had other agendas besides anti-feminist agendas, who have been bankrolling this and fighting back, and we wouldn't have lost Roe v. Wade if they hadn't spent 50 years attacking it. So we are in the midst of a period of backlash that I'm concerned could be, it's already hitting women candidates everywhere. We have some very good women candidates in California that are being, I say, if they run an ugly ad against you, that means they're scared of you. So that's the good side, the backside of backlash. I'm going to look at issues. How do feminist voters find out if candidates have feminist views or records? It depends on what. First, it's relatively easy now because we have a number of major organizations at all levels. I know that many have state and local affiliates as well as national. Obviously, the ones that are major, been there a long time, are NWPC, Emily's List now, and Feminist Majority. But you need to look up somebody's endorsements. So if they are endorsed by any of these key organizations that you've already heard speak, you can be sure they are feminist because they're vetted to make sure they're feminist. And we don't allow the slightest, we have an orthodox view of choice. And you can't say you're pro-choice and not be pro-choice on every public policy issue related to it. So, and I suspect that's everywhere. So, and some of these, a few organizations, including Planned Parenthood, endorse feminist men. if you're endorsed by Planned Parenthood, that's a pretty good indication you're a feminist, because choice is really the underpinning. And I've rarely met somebody who was good on choice who wasn't good on the rest of the issues, which include equal rights amendment, increased access to childcare, equal pay, paid leave, elimination of discrimination on every demographic factor, and making an equitable society. You can also, unfortunately, tell these days what political party they are. There are feminist Republican women. They have been driven out of the party or underground. And so we are at a point that we were not at 50, 60 years ago, when the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both supported choice, childcare, a number of other equal rights amendment and other issues. So we are so polarized at the moment that even though NWPC is multi-party, it's a very rare Republican woman, and then only in nonpartisan offices, that we can find who are willing to be public about their feminism. So the National Republican Party started to strip all those things out. By 80 or 84, pretty much everything feminist in the party platform was gone. And it has become extremely polarized. There are some Republican organizations, Republicans for Choice, and a couple of other ones. They have been pretty moribund for the last few years. None of them have given much or any money in the last 8 to 10 cycles, because they can't find Republicans willing to run for office or able to run against the party. So there are some smaller parties that do have feminist platforms. I think the Women's Party's in New York. I'm not sure how official it is. The Green Party has a great platform, but they may play a role at local office. They don't play a role at the national scene unless they want to be a spoiler. Also, if you see individual endorsements on an endorsement list from people you know to be feminist or organizations in your community, then that's a pretty good sign. You can also, first and foremost, go to the candidate website. And if the candidate is currently an elected official, you can go to their official websites as well. And you can look for their positions. Some of them are very specific and explicit. If they have legislation they've supported, that's even particularly important. Bill lists and other kinds of information, news reports of public statements and election positions. The mainstream media do a really lousy job of covering campaigns anymore. At the national level, it's all horse race and some of this ridiculous stuff around Kamala's race and sex. But there are times when you will see information in the media that clearly identifies a candidate as a feminist. And with choice being on this ballot, we're seeing a little bit more coverage of that. You can attend, if it's local candidates or even not local, you can attend campaign events. You can speak to the candidate directly, and or speak to the people who are there who are supporting her. Campaign websites, finance websites, and you can go to Open Secrets at www.opensecrets.org, which really takes a strong look at it. It uses the FEC data, and it identifies the sources of funding. And if people are supported by anti-choice or anti-feminist organizations, even if they're not talking about their positions, you can sometimes suss that out. So you can also go in California. We have a fairly accessible website for the for campaign finance. One of the issues here is that dark money has been a huge factor. The two scariest books I've ever read were, one was Dark Money by Jane. Somebody knows that. I do this sometimes. I drop last names. Jane Mayer. Yeah. And then Senator Sheldon Whitehouse recently wrote a book called The Scheme. They will show you where the money, and in Whitehouse's case, the court suits have led to where we have some of these systemic challenges. So it is a huge issue, and not just for women candidates. Okay, now, Sherry, can you please just briefly share the document? What organizations identify and support feminist candidates or feminist women, and how do they inform the public? So I have put together a definitely not comprehensive, it's in the link. It's not a comprehensive list because it's only one page. But if you want to do something for feminist candidates, you can start with it. And it starts with the major organizations. many of which have both a nonprofit 501c3 to do issue and research and issue advocacy, and many of which also have a PAC. So I love searching on the internet. So there's a whole, and you can also look on the endorsement lists published by organizations that endorse. Often you can connect to the campaigns directly through those lists, but you will at least know that somebody is or is not endorsed. Most organizations do post their endorsements on their website. They either drive people to the site with social media or they advertise, and some issue news releases. So all the way down at the bottom, I will just point out that one of the neutral organizations is the League of Women Voters. They are very pro-woman. They have fought for women's rights for 100 years. They do not endorse candidates, but they sure give you a lot of information, and they are particularly focused on voter access. So you can use them. Vote411.org is a tremendous tool for voting and for helping others vote. So if the issues, if a candidate supports League of Women Voters issues, they are pretty surely feminists as well. There are many other organizations that entirely do policy research or they focus on specific feminist issues like the ERA, equal pay, childcare, improved support for economics and childcare or healthcare for women. So some have PACs, but mostly don't. But you can learn which of your candidates are consistent with them. And lastly, how can 501c3 organizations encourage voters to support feminist candidates without violating their nonprofit tax status? This is not actually a problem that I have noticed really happening very much. If you have professional people, if you have capable people, as most of the organizations that run both a PAC and a 501c3 do, you just set up your infrastructure, you set up your processes so that you don't cross that line with your nonprofit arm. And I don't know of any case where somebody's gone after a women's organization like NOW or Emily's List or NWPC that says, well, here you are over in your training and education side, making it an issue. It's not actually an issue for Emily's List because you don't have a 501c3. But then, and having a 501c3 is something that many of us have done as a way to bring in more money to do part of our mission, which is to recruit and train women. But it is not something that that is truly, in my view, a thing to fear, because although if Trump wins and Project 2025 becomes the norm, I suspect we will see direct attacks on nonprofits that support women. This is more often seen as a church-related question about churches both on both sides of the political spectrum, but more blatantly, I think, on the right side, supporting candidates in the course of their operations. And I don't know that there have been some efforts to attack their tax deductibility, but I don't know that it will that it's ever been a significant issue. Nonprofits can sponsor candidate forums and debates. That's very helpful, League of Women Voters, as long as they're handled fairly. All of the candidates are invited and the event does not promote any specific candidate. So I'm thinking that there is a potential for this. It's worth everybody being quite careful. Our nonprofit board meets separately from our Inc. board, which is our 501c4. So, if you take reasonable care as an organization, I don't think this is going to be an issue for most organizations. So this topic is so complex and deep. We have just scratched the surface. I've really enjoyed and appreciated the presentations of the others. I can say that I speak as an individual, not as a representative of CWI, to say I hope to God we're going to elect our first woman president in 2 weeks, and I'm voting for every feminist woman that I can, and I'm sending money to those that I can in other states. So donating is really an important piece of what you can do aside from volunteering. So my approach to parity is that 50-50 is not enough. The men had 100 to 0 for about 150 years. I think we could use a little 100 to 0, except that wouldn't be fair. So yeah, one way or the other, we're making progress. We're being pushed back, but this year we can make a huge step forward, and I am looking forward to that. And that's
Great. Thank you, Karen. That was wonderful. Really appreciate all of that information. And it's in the chat, and we'll be sending out further information to everybody who responded to the RSVP.
Oh.
Linda or Tamaya, did you have anything quick to add before we call on Connie in the chat?
I think we should give our audience a chance to chime in. There's not
Okay.
much more time.
Okay. All right. Well, good. Look, I see a lot of people have expressed their strongly held views in the chat. So Connie, do you want to call up the various comments?
Okay, we had one comment from Kristen Stephen in the NWPC. Most many women express reticence in electing a woman as president because they say she wouldn't be as strong as a man, and her hormones monthly would affect her decision making and consistency. Could we not use statistics about women being the head of households in most homes in the United States? What about the collective understanding of women being better at multitasking? I was shocked to see these comments. Takes you back to the 1920s, doesn't it? Wow, thank you.
Well, I see Christina is raising her hand. She has a comment.
I do, and I read that story. I'm quoted briefly in that story, saying something that I very firmly believe, which is to the question of will America elect a woman, the answer is yes. We know this because America already has. So first and foremost, Hillary Clinton didn't claim she won the White House. She accepted the loss and conceded, but millions more Americans did vote for her, and we should not forget that in this moment. Second of all, as someone who works in an organization that works to elect women, I can tell you that women get elected at executive levels in cities, in states. Women get elected in red districts and blue districts and purple districts. And I want to note, I was disappointed in the story because at least a few of the people that they quote with these truly disturbing views were quoted from Trump rallies. There are certainly people who believe that, and there are certainly people who may have their doubts. I believe that that is not the majority. I believe that that is not even that many of the people. I believe that that is not something that shows up in our polling. There are people who are not ever going to vote for Kamala Harris, and some of they may have a variety of different reasons. But for people who are not voting for her because of her gender or race, I'm not sure those people were ever open to her, or even open to Democrats necessarily. And so it's disappointing to see that out there when I think we hear it less in open ends, in polls, we hear it less from reporters and on the ground. This question of will America elect a woman is someone, and I worked for Hillary Clinton. We did hear it more then. And I think that question has gone away as we have watched more women leaders. We have seen Nancy Pelosi give it to Donald Trump, repeatedly. We have seen leaders on both sides of the aisle. We have seen women leaders, and it becomes more of something that we see when we think of a candidate. If we close our eyes and think of a candidate, we might think of Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren or Nikki Haley or any number of women. We might just not automatically think of a man. And that's something that used to be the case. If you said, think of a candidate, voters thought of a man. And so what I would say is disappointing. Yes, it is frustrating that anyone has that point of view. But from our, and there are any number of reasons that someone could vote against Kamala Harris, but I will say we find it to be less of a concern than maybe that story made it out to be.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Good points. Karen, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say that the stories have been very superficial, and they will pit one anti-feminist person against one pro-feminist person as if that's indicative of anything. Although, and I think the polls are just weird, but there are still memes that are being used in campaigns. I was elected mayor on a grassroots campaign, and my opponent was a Democrat who basically tried to make me look a little weak on policing, but since I had the police union, it wasn't very convincing. 4 years later, when I ran for re-election in '93, my opponent's motto was tough enough to be mayor. And we still see those kinds of slogans. We have a Black woman, wonderful, incredibly good Black woman running for mayor in our city right now. And the man who's running against her appears to be white. He's actually half Black, but he doesn't talk about his racial background. He just talks about what a miserable, incompetent person she is because she's never held elected office before. So those things are still out there. They're in some cases worse than others. But I just want to say that we have a long way to go before sexism, misogyny, and racism and all of the other isms are gone. And that is really an important structural issue for us to continue to fight to address. And that's why I love being at this group, because everybody in this room is dedicated to that.
Great. Anybody else want to comment? We have a few minutes left.
I was just going to say really fast, Jan, I think the advent of the term identity politics also had an adverse effect on women as they ran, because they created that term. A lot of folks ran from who they were instead of embracing who they were. And as women, I find that there are more things, the things that we think eliminate us from being good candidates and good office holders are the very things that make us perfect to hold office. And so the advent of that term, which was intended to be negative for us, is actually quite the opposite. It's positive.
Those are good points.
There was a story yesterday that essentially blamed Kamala Harris because the excitement level seems to have diminished since she first became a candidate. And he was the writer, who's an old white man, was essentially blaming her and charging her to restore the excitement of the campaign. I wanted to say she raised $1 billion in a shorter time period than any other politician on the face of the earth. So what do you mean there's no excitement in this race? They're just not talking to the right people.
Yeah. Connie, are there other comments or questions we should look at in the chat?
I had one comment that Arnold Palmer's daughter was super offended and said West Pennsylvania deserved more substance. I happened to see her comment. She also said this was a romanticizing of a relationship with Palmer that never existed. I think it's just a simple case of reverse penis envy.
Oh, we needed a good laugh.
AAUW was sued by a right-wing group because they gave scholarships to African-American women. Then gave in to save the money litigation would have cost. That's a shame.
Oh,
Let me see. Some new messages here.
I was vaguely aware of the AAUW case, and I think it's potentially very dangerous because AAUW is a totally private organization. They presumably, because they're tax exempt, they have a problem. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't understand the legal basis that they thought they might lose. Sometimes these suits are filed and get settled just in order to keep you from draining your organization. But it was an unfortunate circumstance.
And we have a comment from Loretta Gubernatis that sadly it takes a generation to change imaging. Even today, if you ask kids to draw a picture of a scientist, they draw a man in a web quote. So,
well, I think we're, anything else, Connie?
from Regina Coles, is there a formula to calculate the voting election gender gap state by state? How do more recent voter registrations factor into the gender gap? I'm thinking primarily younger voters, students, Swifties, etc., who seem to be unknown to the process.
To the pollsters.
Right. I think pollsters pick who they talk to. And I think we've heard a lot of screwy polls that aren't really right. My 2 cents.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to an end. And let me just say, we will be sending out some additional material maybe some of the questions that Regina just asked about who's, if we have any knowledge by gender of folks just recently registering, especially among the Swifties, we'll incorporate that as well and send it out to everybody who sent in an RSVP. This has been an incredible conversation. I feel like maybe we should have a follow-up, but all of us seem to be way too busy focused on November 5th. So perhaps that's out of the question, but we can certainly do a, I don't like to use the word postmortem since that seems very depressing, but maybe we could do a follow-up after the election. So thank you to everybody, especially to Christina Reynolds, especially to Tamaya Dennard, to Karen Humphrey, who's just a gem, and Linda Berg, my dear friend, who knows everything there is to be known about politics and candidates. And thanks to everybody who signed in and participated. And let's keep our fingers crossed for November 5th. Bye-bye.